Henry Evans was living his version of what we might call the American dream. He graduated from De Smet High School in St. Louis. He graduated again from the University of Notre Dame and then did a master's in business at Stanford Business School. Married his high school sweetheart, Jane. By the age of 40, he and Jane had 4 children, and he was the chief financial officer of a startup in Silicon Valley. Then on the morning of August 29, 2002, as he was taking his children to school, he noticed his vision narrowing and his speech slurring. And so he went home, and when he got home, his wife, Jane, made him go to the emergency room. He didn't want to go to the emergency room, of course, because he's a guy, but he did go there. And after he got to the emergency room, he almost immediately lapsed into a coma. And when he woke up 2 weeks later, the only part of his body he could move was his eyes. Everything else was paralyzed. He had, at the age of 40, a birth defect had manifested in his life and created these very significant stroke-like symptoms. He breathed, could not breathe on his own, could not swallow on his own. He was on about 25 different medications. And as we might say, he and his family had to face reality. What is reality? Is reality something that we can only face, or is it something that we can shape by how we face reality? If you believe that reality can only be faced, you're in the wrong place this morning. However, if you believe that reality is something that can be shaped by how we face it, then let's get started. God, we thank you for this day and for this time and for this greatest commandment. May we indeed this day and every day love you with all of who we are and love our neighbors as we love ourselves. We ask this prayer in the name and in the spirit of the one who gave us such a commandment and gives us the power to fulfill it, Jesus Christ. Amen. We're finishing this focus on deeply simple love rooted in that great commandment, to love God with all of our heart, with the part of us which is below the level of consciousness. So we might call it intuition or instinct or emotion. And to love our God with all of our soul, this is the animating life force that is within us, and with all of our mind or understanding. And today, to love God with all of our strength. When we hear that word, perhaps automatically we think about physical strength. And yet the Greek word for strength is much different than that. It's more about loving God with our power and our might and our force and our ability, not limited to the physical power and might and force and ability that we have. To paraphrase Jesus, which is always dangerous, of course, to love God with all of our strength might be to love God with the part of us that decides and chooses and wills. Some say choice and decision-making and will is simply an illusion. It's a story that we tell ourselves, that we live in a mechanical world, a universe where life is reducible to stimulus and response. And not even response, because response assumes some level of thought, stimulus and reaction. It's all at the level of biology. And is that what life is? Is it mechanical, predestined, predetermined, or can our wills actually make a difference? An organic understanding of life focuses on the ability of the organism to initiate and to respond to what's happening in the environment. A mechanical understanding of the universe cannot explain why one young girl assaulted in terrible ways spirals down into an unhealthy life, and another young girl assaulted in the exact same way becomes Maya Angelou or Oprah Winfrey. A mechanical understanding of life cannot account for how similar or same circumstances provide such different responses in people. My preferred label for this understanding of life, this organic understanding of life, is responsibility. Responsibility, the ability that we have to choose how to respond to what happens to us in life. Because we are organisms, because life is organic and not mechanical, then this responsibility is natural. Life naturally moves towards life, and we can cooperate with that movement. We can usually not control what happens to us. If we could, most of what happens to us wouldn't. right? We can't control that. And yet, with very rare circumstances, we can control how we respond to what happens to us in life. H. Richard Niebuhr says, the image of responsibility asks in every moment of decision, what is going on? And then seeks the fitting response. Seeking the fitting response to what is really going on is another way of talking about responsibility. We can respond imaginatively, creatively, or we can react destructively and negatively. Another way of saying it is we can help shape what helps shape us. We can help shape what helps shape us. Reality is not something that must be faced only, accepted passively. Reality can be shaped as we face it in imaginative, creative ways. Studies have shown that people who love God with their whole strength, power, force, ability, responsible people who help shape what helps shape them have some characteristics in common. One of the characteristics that such people have in common is a sense of optimism. And I don't mean Pollyanna-ish pretending that everything is just okay in the world. I mean optimism in the sense that something good can come out of every set of circumstances, echoing perhaps Paul in Romans 8, that in everything God is working to bring about good for those who love God, who remain open to God. Don Beatner's written a book called The Blue Zones, a book about centenarians, and it's not about the members of this church. It's about people who have lived to be 100 years of age, that definition of centenarian. And he has found that people who live to be 100 years of age are optimistic. As he puts it in the book, the grumps tend to die out before they get to be 100. The pessimists, the complainers, the whiners, the moaners usually don't live to 100. Although if you spend much time with them, it'll seem like they've been around 100 years. But people who do that often don't live biologically to the age 100. Thomas Edison developed the sense and this perspective of optimism as he was trying to find the element that would help him invent the electric bulb. He went through 2,000 of them at least before he found tungsten, before he found the element that would work. And he taught himself, he willed himself to think about that process in this way. As he had 2,000 elements that didn't work, he didn't think of that as 2,000 failures. He had eliminated 2,000 possibilities, which meant there were less possibilities left that he had to try. That's optimism. And people who are responsible, people who help shape what helps shape them, are optimistic. And people who are responsible people rely on one another. There's strength in numbers. Responsibility is not only an individual matter, it's a community matter. The outward and visible sign, if you will, of a web of relationships and experiences. And it's in those relationships and experiences at church and in other situations that we learn mastery and doggedness and love and moral courage and hope. We see negative and positive examples of strength in numbers this last week as we have watched what has unfolded in Baltimore, the negative in the riots, the positive in that video that many of you in this room have seen of the young mother who, shall we say, persuaded her young son to go home and not be a part of the riots that were going to happen in Baltimore. That strength in numbers. That young man has a better chance at life because he had that and has that relationship with his mother. That's responsibility. That's helping to shape what is helping to shape the lives of so many in that community and beyond. It almost goes without saying that responsible people are spiritual and religious by and large. There are a few exceptions to that, but almost everyone who is responsible lives out their faith in powerful ways. And they pick their battles. They focus their attention and energy on what can be willed and influenced rather than on what cannot. And in doing that, lower their anxiety and increase their responsibility. A personal example is that each of my parents had significant cancers, and each of them had heart disease. And so as I think about my life going on from this point on, I can focus my will and energy on what I cannot influence. I could try to choose parents with better genetics. I don't think that's going to work out. Or I can focus my will and attention on what I can control or influence, my diet, my exercise, how I live from day to day, as best I can to play as well as I can for as long as I can, the hand I've been dealt. That's responsibility. That's picking one's battles. And then also responsible people pick how they battle. Flexible repertoire. Nature over time favors flexibility over rigidity. Most of us have seen videos of earthquakes or of tornadoes or hurricanes, have we not, where the flexible trees make it through and the rigid ones get snapped off. Flexibility over rigidity, more times than not, is favored by nature. So responsibility is natural, it's imaginative, it's a creative response to what's happening in life. And helping shape what helps shape us is about optimism and strength in numbers and faith and picking one's battles and picking how one battles. So what does that look like? Well, by the time Henry Evans left the hospital 4 months after he entered it, he could turn his head. He had developed that ability, and he could move one digit on his hand. And that was it. He could breathe on his own, and he could swallow. But externally, moving his head and moving one digit on one hand was all that he could do. And so for the next few years, he thought about suicide, and he communicated with his wife about whether she would help him take his life. And she said to him, "There's a reason God left you with your mind, and you have life." Those are two incredible gifts that we take for granted every day. And yet she could not will for him to live. Only Henry could will for himself to live, and he did. A few years later, I was watching CNN, and there was a story on CNN about developing robots, and his mind quickly made the connection between robots and folks like himself, quadriplegics, people who could not move hardly at all. He immediately realized the potential of robots to help severely disabled individuals. He had learned by this point to use a head tracker, which would translate minute movements of his head and of his eyes into movement of the keyboard. And so he could type, and he did type out an email to the folks who produced the story, got in connection with the people making the robots, and together they created an enterprise that they call Robots for Humanity. And they first focused on the tasks that would be most helpful, such as scratching, because all of his senses were still sensing, he just couldn't do anything about it. Imagine living with an itch that cannot be scratched. And then he learned how to shave himself using the robot. From there, Henry began to use a device called Polly, as in Polly the parrot, that would sit on someone's shoulder. And it's a harness with a camera, and the person walking will take Henry along with them on a virtual tour. He's gone to several museums around the world virtually. And through his eye movements and his head movements, he can turn the camera one way or the other, up or down, to see that museum. He's learned how to fly a drone now, so he can see what's going on outside in his garden and up on his roof and beyond. And because there are many people like this, they've come together as a network, and if the robot is not physically in their presence, if it's in a laboratory somewhere else, he and some other people play robot soccer. As he says, all work and no play make for a dull quadriplegic. He has an amazing sense of humor, amazing resilience, a responsibility, all of that done. And at the summit, because we have the screens, we'll show a clip of about 5 minutes of his life. It is an amazing thing to see. And here's what he writes, and if you get the Reader's Digest, the May issue, says, from a distance, he writes, all humans are disabled. As humans, we adapted to our environment through evolution. We developed sight and hearing and speech, and yet these adaptations are quite limited. We can't run more than about 25 miles an hour. We can't fly. We can't stay underwater forever. All humans are limited by nature in many ways. He said, I may have lost a few of the natural adaptations that evolution afforded me, but I have adapted, often in a way similar to how you have adapted to nature's limitations. So if we had a mental checklist, imaginative, yep, he's imaginative. Creative, yep. Optimistic, yes. Partnerships, faith, picking his battles, helping to shape what helps shape him in life, yes. That's what it means, and that's what it looks like to love God with all of our strength. Friends, life is not predestined, it's not mechanical, it's organic. And we indeed can respond creatively and imaginatively to what happens to us in life. Life is about how we respond more than what happens, helping to shape what helps shape us. That's part of what it means to love God with our whole heart, soul, mind, and strength. Make it so, God, in you and in me and in us together. We give you thanks, oh God, that you have given us through faith and in other ways responsibility, that we can have the ability to choose how to respond to what happens to us in life. Help us, God, to lean into life, to lean toward the natural part of life that has imagination and creativity and flexibility and optimism, that relies on other people to do with us what cannot be done by an individual, that indeed trusts in you, that you are at work in all circumstances of life to bring good out of what we see as bad. We give you thanks for all of that and more in the name and in the spirit of Jesus, the crucified and the risen one. Amen.